Welcome to the seminar and lecture series at School of Arts and Sciences, Ahmedabad University. And we are very pleased to have with us a very distinguished speaker, an author and a mythologist and a thinker with us today here at the seminar and lecture series, which we are actually going in the online format this semester. And without further ado, I would actually like to welcome my colleague and Professor Aparajita Basu from the School of Arts and Sciences to introduce this very exciting panel speaker and also our dean. So Aparajita, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarthak. So we are very lucky today to have Mr. Pattanaik visit us a second time. I believe that he visited us in January 2018. And the event was such a success that we are very pleased to have you visit us again. So today what we'll be talking about is pluralism in Indian mythology. So many of you would be aware of Mr. Pattanaik's work already. He has written on the relevance of mythology in modern times. He's the author of over 50 books and 1,000 columns. And some of you would have caught his TV show Devdutt. And he's also written on culture, leadership, and the Indian approach to management. Now, I also see that he's written that Mr. Pattanaik's desire is to get Saraswati out of the closet. Saraswati belongs everywhere. She has to flow everywhere. And his body of work is aimed at making knowledge accessible, making Saraswati flow everywhere. Okay. So, Professor Patrick French, many of you would be aware, is the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Ahmedabad. He also additionally holds the position as Professor for the Public Understanding of the Humanities. And he is an award-winning historian and biographer. And his most recent publication is The World is What It Is, the authorized biography of V.S. Naipaul. And as you must be aware, Professor French has won a number of important prizes related to his very long and distinguished career as a writer. So I will stop speaking there and hand it over to you, Patrick.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much to Aparajita and also to Sarthak, and above all to Devdutt Pattanaik for joining us today at a virtual version of Ahmedabad University School of Arts and Sciences. Thank you all very much to the admin staff at the school and to the IT team at Ahmedabad University for pulling everything together. We are broadcasting live over YouTube as well as through the Zoom meeting, and there'll be an edited version or a captioned version of this available over on the university's YouTube channel in a day or so from now. And I think that we should really think of this first event with Devdutt at the beginning of the academic year for the monsoon semester 2020, a very unusual time when all of our plans, intentions, and hopes and dreams have been disrupted by the coronavirus pandemic, something that a few epidemiologists and public health scholars had been anticipating for a while. But I think for most of us, it's come totally out of the blue, and it's required quite a lot of rethinking. And Devdutt is a great rethinker. He's very good at pushing people to think in a different way. So it's appropriate, I think, that he would be speaking to us today on his ideas about pluralism in Indian mythology. And as Aparajita said, he has been at Ahmedabad University in person a couple of years ago. I'm actually just going to share an image to prove it. Here's the evidence. Which this was a photo that Mayur took of the whole of the lecture theatre, and it's incredible. None of these people are wearing masks. It's like this is the old days when everybody just crammed in and we all listened to each other, and it seems like a world away. But I thought that Devdutt, apart from welcoming you to start the seminar and lecture series for the academic year, I'd also say that we will have subsequent events around everything from astrophysics to language. We've got a lot of distinguished speakers and scholars from inside and outside academia who will be joining. And that with my sort of academic hat on to start with, what I should do to begin with is to ask you the academics question about the title that you've chosen, Pluralism in Indian Mythology. And I'm sure you've had this before, that you ask a professor a question and they come back to you with another question. You'll say a word like democracy, or you'll say something like civil society, and they'll say, well, what do you mean by democracy? So I'm going to start off by I know that you're going to give a sort of introductory little talk to begin the conversation, but I'm going to start by saying, well, what do you mean by pluralism? What do you mean by Indian? What do you mean by mythology? So welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Ahmedabad University, for inviting me. So let's begin with the simplest of the words, Indian. And that just says how complex this topic is, but by Indian, I mean the subcontinent of India. Now the word South Asia is being used. In the old days, they would use words like Bharatvarsha, Jambudvipa, Sukhavati. Basically, the land between the Himalayas on one side and the ocean on the other. This peninsula, this vast land with many rivers. What is unique about this land and the ideas which emerged from here, the most important idea, as far as I'm concerned, from a mythological point of view, being rebirth. Rebirth being the most foundational idea, which we don't really talk about. But that's the fundamental idea, and rooted to this idea of rebirth is the idea of pluralism, because it allows you a lot of space and a lot of flexibility and a lot of fluidity to deal with very complex ideas, which a straitjacketed one life does not allow for various reasons, because it just gives you many more ways of thinking. Of course, it has its own problems. Like any idea, it has strengths and weaknesses. The one life idea, which dominates most of the world, has its own limitations. Rebirth has its own limitations. But this is so pluralism, the ability to think multiple things simultaneously, is locked in the idea of a very Indian tick, the Indian head shake, which I keep saying, the Indian head shake is what pluralism is all about. It is, but it is not so. And it is the Indian philosophical idea of bheda bhed. It is divided but not divided. It is diversity and unity. These kind of, the head shakes continuously. It is khatta meetha. It is, we are like this and not like this. Indians are known to be vague and never quite binary. So it has its own, as I said, it's a positive things and negative things. Mythology, so pluralism is about multiple ideas simultaneously coexisting in a world. India is the land for me between Himalayas and the sea, which has given the idea of rebirth that allows us to be words like we use these words loosely, tolerant, accepting, words which can't quite use in the 21st century, especially based on data. And then you have mythology. Mythology is a subject that I have nurtured on my own while I've read the books. And as a subject, it emerged only in the 19th century, like history. Both history and mythology, as we know it today, are 19th century subjects. They didn't exist in the 18th century. They come in the 19th century, they emerge, they transform, they refine themselves. And today, when I read books, I find a lot of gaps in the Western books which are writing, because I think they're sort of self-limiting themselves in their thoughts. Also with the rise of post-structuralism, post-modernism, these kind of concepts that are emerging in philosophy and literature, mythology has become a challenging subject. But I define mythology as subjective truth of a people, communicated through stories, symbols, rituals, communicated over generations. It has to be a generational shift over generations, stories, symbols, and rituals. So the imagined truth of a people. So that's mythology as far as I am concerned. And my interest began about 25 years ago, trying to understand how, I would hear the word mythology used very loosely. Even today, people use mythology using 19th century terminologies. And they would use mythology and say it's not religion, but it is mythology, and then there's way of life. And I'm trained in medicine, I'm trained in science, and therefore definitions are very important to me. I'm obsessed with definitions because you can't move ahead. And I would always, I've stopped seeking perfect definitions. I focus on functional definitions, because as we know, every scholar tries to find flaws in other definitions and tries to come up with his own refined, and the definitions get more and more complex, so complicated that in the end, the professor, instead of clarifying, starts confusing. And which is how subjects have emerged, without being just a bit kinder to us human beings, that, it's Wittgenstein. The language will never get it correctly. Understanding is always misunderstanding. Derrida, all these people have come up with these very nice ideas about language, which I feel is very important. That don't try to be perfect. It's the Indian idea of 19-20, sort of, approximately, or like the Indian cook will say, salt to taste, which is not an objective number, but communicates very clearly how to cook a food. So a functional definition, subjective truth of a people communicated over generations through stories, symbols, and rituals. Now, the reason I study, because you can't study mythology in India. There is no course. There is one very rudimentary but very popular course in Bombay University, Sanskrit department. And it is interesting, it's part of the Sanskrit department. Which department should mythology be taught under? Because it's a combination of literature, it's a combination of anthropology, it's a combination of political science, it's a combination of applied mythology, advertising, communications. So maybe one day University of Ahmedabad will have a course on mythology, which someday, but the thing is, we don't know how to study it. And when I would read books on mythology around the world, I would find India, I would always have a problem with what they would write about India, because I live in India and it was my reality. And I was never embarrassed by the word mythology. And one of the biggest learnings for me was the people who wrote on mythology assumed they were not in myth. They assumed they were outside the realm of mythology. So whether it's Claude Levi-Strauss, whether it is Freud, whether it is not Freud, not so much, but Max Muller, they genuinely saw it as something outside. It was the other which had mythology, the self did not. Today in the postmodern world, we know that's not true. We all live in this kind of a complex world of ideas. But coming to the topic today, the reason for me the topic was important is because in Jain mythology and philosophy, there are ideas like Anekantavad, multiple ways of thinking. India has always seen things in complex ways. So you'll have these weird ideas that Shiva is Vishnu, but Vishnu is Shiva. Or formless God is form, but is also formless. Buddha is Vishnu, but Vishnu is Buddha. So you have this constant, this is that and that is this kind of ideas. And the absence, the fluidity of it. And that gave me hope. I was reading recently the life of Jnaneshwar, and I want to tell the story of life of Jnaneshwar. I realize many people don't know the story. In Maharashtra, most people know it because in Maharashtra, it's a very important story. The story is of the 13th century. And this is the time when regional languages are emerging. Regional languages are emerging. And the story of Jnaneshwar is very interesting. It begins with a hermit Guruji, one day learning that one of his followers, a young man who has taken the ascetic vow, has actually taken the ascetic vow without telling his wife. And he gets a little upset and says, if you're married, you cannot be an ascetic without permission of your wife. Since you have not taken the permission of your wife, you have to go back to her. So the ascetic is forced to go back to his wife and become a householder. Now, when he does this, they belong to a Brahmin community. The Brahmins get very angry, saying that you took an ascetic's vow, you cannot come back and become a householder, so you cannot be a Brahmin, you cannot live with us, and they excommunicate. Now, so this man and his wife, so although he becomes the householder, now he loses the Brahmin privilege. He's obviously a very well-read, educated man, but he is kicked out of the community. Where does he go and stay? We don't know. But imagine in a village, there is a Brahmin community. Where would he go and live? Would he live with the Dalits? Would he live with the peasants, with the Maratha community? But that Maratha community was not there at that time. 13th century is too early. Historians don't know where he lived. But he obviously lived with common folk. with people who are not as privileged as the Brahmin community. So he's experiencing a very different world around him. There are 3 brothers and 1 sister. Their 4 children are born to this couple. And they are raised inside the house, they are Brahmins, because that's the sanskar, the upbringing. But outside the house, their neighbors are obviously not Brahmins. So it's a unique ecosystem he grows up in. At a particular age, they want their children to be educated in the Brahmin way. So the father, this man, goes to the Brahmins and says, will you please do the thread ceremony for my children so that they can learn the Vedas? And they say, no, we will not do it. As long as you're alive, we won't do it. If you do jala samadhi, that means kill yourself in water, we may consider it. And so for the sake of their children's future, the man and his wife commit suicide in water. And these 4 orphans go to the Brahmin community and says, our parents have died. You promised that you will become Brahmins, and educate us. And the Brahmins refuse to do so. So the children are now orphans. They are not part of the community. They have no one to take care of them, and they have to fend for themselves. And these 4 orphans live in isolation. One of the eldest brother goes away and becomes what is called a Nath Yogi. He joins the Naths, the Machindranath, Gorakhnath, and these are very aggressive monastic orders. And the middle brother, Jnaneshwar, becomes the student of his elder brother and is motivated to translate the Bhagavad Gita in the local language Marathi. And he calls it Bhavartha Dipika. Now that's a very interesting word because he uses the word Bhavartha Dipika. So he's saying it's not a translation. It is a translation of the emotion that you find in the Gita. And I'm going to translate it in Marathi or old Marathi Prakrit, early Marathi, very old Marathi. It's the first Marathi literature that emerges. Now this is a revolutionary act. The Brahmins are very upset that he has taken the language of the gods and given it a local language, made it accessible to the people. But he calls it not a translation, but a kind of a rewriting of the Gita, the way he understands it, focusing on the emotion, Bhavartha Dipika. And it is a beautiful work of poetry, use metaphors of plants and animals, which is very agricultural, revealing that this man lived with farmers and with peasants and with serfs. And he writes this beautiful poetry in Marathi, and it's full of affection and love. Now, here is a young man who has every reason to be very angry. His parents have been treated unfairly. He has been treated unjustly. There is no justice in his life. He has been treated very, very unfairly. He should be an angry revolutionary. But what is he? He is a gentle soul who's writing. He is subversive in his own way. He's turning a Sanskrit literature, the word of Krishna, into Jnaneshwari, which is Bhavartha Dipika in Marathi, getting it access. So he is doing a revolutionary act, but it is full of affection. It's full of affection. And I found that story very interesting because it's happening in 13th century India. And it told me a lot about pluralism, because everybody thinks that when life is unfair to you, you must be angry. And when you are angry, you have to revolt, and revolution is always violent. At least that's the way, classic Marxist thinking is. And here is a young boy who theoretically comes from a highly privileged background, is treated very unfairly, but turns out to be a very gentle soul. And really his education is he's learning from the Nath yogis who emerged in India in the 13th century, 11th, 12th, 13th century in North India. Machindranath is known for being aggressive. Gorakhnath is known for being aggressive. But the gentleness of the poetry, when you read the poetry, it's almost funny. It chuckles. It's sweet. His brother says, okay, enough of praising me. Can you please start with the poetry? It's so much of affection. And I felt that was the soul of India. A soul of India, which even in misery, somehow retains humanity. And for me, this is what mythology teaches you. Indian mythology. For all the violence in the world, for all the unjustness in the world, for all the nastiness in the world, there is space for kindness, because that is where wisdom lies. And I think that is what I thought should be the starting point of our conversation today, because there's so much anger on the social media. We are seeing young people being angry, and we're told the only way anger should manifest is through angry revolution and being nasty, both using foul language or sometimes using physical violence. And here is a man who turns it into a creative product. It's creativity, it's art. He turns it into literature, revolutionary literature, but full of love. And I think that is interesting, because we all know that violence, people want to be violent, but at the end of the day, it doesn't solve anything. And every human being goes through crisis of violence, and we all are violent sometimes in our lives, but it's not something to be proud of.
And so when Ganesha was writing this commentary on the Gita, he would have been how old? I mean, just a teenager.
Yeah, 15, 16.
So
Maybe
it's an extraordinary idea that that kind of work could be thought of and envisaged and written by somebody so young.
The thing is, the tragic thing is, at a very young age, he decides to take samadhi in Alandi. And some people have argued it's despair. He creates this work and he chooses to move on. He doesn't want to live. So some people argue that it's samadhi, and of course, from a mythological point of view, he voluntarily gives up his body. Why would a young child want to voluntarily give up his body? It's almost a despair. So there is a tragicness of it. It's not all sweet, but there is this unhappiness in that idea of this young man voluntarily abandoning his young body. His sister Muktabai is a poet, and this creates Maharashtra Dharma. There's a whole movement of poetry emerging in India at this time, from people from all communities, from every community: farmers, potters, barbers, tailors, Dalit. Every community in Maharashtra has these poets: Janabai, Muktabai, and they're all singing these lovely poems. It's full of pain. It's a lot of pain, but it is also beautiful at the same time. And I think it tells you something about, something that Hindutva, by the way, is ashamed of. It feels that you should be violent, but I mean, that's not the soul of our country.
Can I just remind everybody, now that we've got a couple of hundred people on the Zoom call and on the YouTube link, that if you'd like to ask any questions, then you can put them in the chat box directed to me or to one of the co-hosts, and we'll come on to your questions during the later part of today's seminar. Devdutt, what I want to ask you in response to what you've just said is about the 19th century codification of Dharma, about the fact that people like Raja Rammohan Roy came up with this idea of Hinduism as a kind of catch-all term for a very varied cosmology as it existed in different parts of the Indian subcontinent. From this distance of time, I mean, almost 200 years later, how does it make sense? Was it more of almost a colonial idea that you had to be a religion with certain things like a holy book and a set of scriptures and a priesthood and so on? Or was that codification something that was probably inevitable? In other words, do you think that it was a distortion, if you like, of the different practices of Dharma as lived experience in different places in the subcontinent?
One must compare religion with citizenship. Citizenship is a new idea. It did not exist 100 years ago. The idea of a passport, the idea of a visa, you are obliged to be a citizen. So the question is, 200 years ago, if you told someone you're a citizen of which land, he wouldn't be able to answer this question. It's a new idea. And today, everybody needs to be a citizen. We need to have this piece of paper to justify who we are, right? The people in Andaman, the Jarua tribals, don't have this concept. The Bhils who have lived here for thousands of years will say, what do you mean Indian? We are Bhil. We are not Indian. We are Bhil. But you'll say, no, you're part of this. We have decided for them that they are Indians. You've not asked them whether they want to be. The Bhils, the Gonds, they are living their lives. I mean, they have lived their lives the way they have lived. And somebody from outside will come and say, oh, by the way, you are part of this ecosystem and you need to have this piece of paper. And that's a simple, and that's exactly what religion is. A couple of 100 years ago, somebody came up with the idea that everybody needs to have a religion. And religion is something that you have membership into. You have to be baptized into it and you can leave it. You can't get baptized into Hinduism and you can't leave it. Even though ISKCON would argue otherwise, or Arya Samaj would argue otherwise, these are 19th century concepts. These organizations also came in the 19th century. You can't be a Hindu. Nobody made me a Hindu. I was born in a family and I inherit two things: my father's property or my mother's property and caste. Your caste is inherited and you can't do anything about it. It's just there. You didn't have this idea of joining a community. Now, Manu Devadevan, this historian, recent historian, written this book called Prehistory of Hinduism, is a fantastic book where he says that roughly about 1,000 years ago, if you went, people, when you read the old books like Mani Meghalaya and all that, you never hear them talking that as themselves as Hindu. They have vocations. I'm a king, I'm a cobbler, I'm a poet, I'm a musician. They would worship gods. They would worship holy men. They would worship a Jain holy man, a Buddhist holy man, what was called, they would be what is called sadhakas, shravakas. They would listen to holy men, or they would be upasakas. They would worship different kinds of gods. So you had like your own particular pantheon of gods and sages that you worshipped in your village, and people identified you by which village do you belong to and which caste do you have. That's it. Nobody needed religion to define. So there was no need for it. So the need to have religion is emerging only after the Europeans come in. Even when the Muslims came to India, there is more a cultural divide. So in the 14th century, you have, let's begin at the beginning. You have the word India being used by outsiders to refer to a land, Al-Hind. So it's a very vague term, like the way we would mean China means everything from beyond the Himalayas. It's Tibet and it's Korea, everything is Chinna Desha, Hinda Desha. So it's a very vague term. Turukudesha. So Turukudesha is the land of the Turks. Now Turukudesha, Ruma. Ruma means anything from Byzantium to Italy. So it's a very vague term because you didn't travel that far. It didn't matter. Now what happens is, when do Indians start using the word Hindu? When the Turks come to India in the 10th and 11th century and they're marching and they're becoming a military force. Initially they come as raiders, they come, they take and they go. They come and take and they go. Gradually they start settling in and a new, what is called the Persianate culture starts to enter India. And you know that they are not us. It is in response to the other that the concept of Hindu Dharma emerges. So you have writers, the Vijayanagar Empire, using the word Hindu Dharma, Turuka Dharma. Now this is a cultural term. It is not used in a religious term. This is being used in the 14th century. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu uses it. Kabir uses it. He's very clear, Turuku Dharma. He knows what is a Muslim. You get access to Muslim, you do the Shahada. This is what defines a Muslim. This is what defines a Hindu. And there's a clear Kabir poetry which says these are the things. And they use this division, only these two divisions, nothing else. Then the British come in, and then the British now want to put everything in a document. It needs to be a neat Excel sheet where there are clear columns, and the columns now create problems because now everybody needs to have a religion or a caste, which is problematic because while many people have caste, all of them don't have caste. While many people have religion, all of them don't have religion. Classic Indian problem, mostly but not quite. So then their documentation creates its own bunch of problems. And Hinduism as a religion becomes important. Raja Ram Mohan Roy, at that time, they're talking about, the French Revolution has happened. People are being educated by, somebody, I got distracted over there. You have got this idea of brotherhood and French Revolution, American Revolution. And this is being read by the young, educated Bengali Bhadralok, and really the affluent men, Savarna men, reading these books and deciding to reform Hinduism. They took it upon themselves to reform Hinduism without consulting anyone. They decided Hinduism needs reform. And that's where Raja Ram Mohan Roy comes up with this word Hinduism. It's there also in the 18th century by other scholars, but really Raja Ram Mohan in 1816 uses this word. Now there's a counter movement to that. Like anything in history, there's a counter movement. And you have Chandranath Basu in 1894 using the word Hindutva as a counter to reform, which nobody talks about. Hindutva comes in 1894 with Chandranath Basu in Bengal. This word is then used by Savarkar I don't know whether Savarkar was familiar with Chandranath Basu or he created this new word on his own. We don't know that. But in 1923, he uses this word Hindutva in a political term, saying, do you think India is your holy land? Now, this was a very clever move because for a Muslim, the holy land is Mecca. For a Christian, it is Jerusalem. And that was a very clever way of excluding and creating the other. So the word starts taking its new meaning and suddenly the Hindu and Muslim becomes two bodies of work. History tells us it's not that simple. So now we have got citizenship and we are fighting over citizenship. So Czechoslovakia and you have got this Yugoslavia and these people, Balkanization, because now you're creating a new boundary, a new form of tribe called a nation state. And it is also going to create mess. It's not going to create a better world. It's just going to create a nasty world. And everybody thinks at the beginning that nation state is going to be the life and democracy is going to save us until the trolls arrived. So this is what happens. History has its movements and we are witnessing the death of religion as a concept and the rise of nationalism as a concept. This will die too. And the Bhil tribe will be saying, when you feel, will you please make up your mind and become Bhil once again?
So just to go back to the root of what you're arguing. I think there is a case for saying that in the Abrahamic religions, if you're Muslim or if you're Jewish or if you're Christian, that you are obliged to convert and you are obliged to follow a certain set of precepts in a way that you are not in Hinduism.
No.
So if you then link this to what you're talking about around the time of Ram Mohan Roy and others, and then to, like you're saying, people being obliged to become citizens, to have passports, something that really kicked off globally in around the early 20th century. It coincides roughly with World War I. And now, 100 years later, what citizenship you have, what passport you have, is vitally important for all of us. It's very difficult for people not to have that form of identity. But the thing I just want to press you on a bit more is it useful to think of Hinduism as a cosmology rather than as a religion? Is religion an inappropriate word given the very, very long history of different Hindu practices in India?
Yes, because religion by definition seeks uniformity and homogeneity.
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing is, we use the word Christian religion, but the Christians can't agree what constitutes Christianity. Otherwise, you wouldn't have Protestants killing the Catholics, killing the born-agains, and I get that two of them in a room, get the Orthodox Christians in the same room and they will not agree with the Pope and the Pope won't agree with anybody. They can't even decide whether homosexuality is in or out or, whether you should wear a frock to church or not. All those things, even one God cannot homogenize religion. So this whole idea, this human yearning to homogenize all humans, I think it comes from this terrible discomfort with diversity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And Indian thought celebrates diversity until the arrival of Hindutva.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I do remember going to Jerusalem, where you have so many different so many different religions, and Jerusalem is, of course, vitally important for at least three of the world's largest religions. And there's this incredible sort of tension. It's a very creative, spiritual tension, but everybody wants a different thing. And even within holy places, people are expecting different practices to be followed. Let me just do one question that interests me, Devdutt, is I just want to go back a bit because you have such a varied career and way of writing. Like you said, you're a medical doctor. You also have this background in management, and then you've done books and TV shows on mythology and connected areas. I'm interested of sort of seeing that we were speaking about Naneshwar as the young writer. What were you thinking? What were you conceptualizing when you were in your teens and your early 20s? Are these ideas that have had a long gestation?
They do. I don't think mythology was like foremost in my mind. It was getting, like a typical middle class Bombay guy. You want to do well in your 10th standard. I did very well. And then 12th standard also, I did reasonably well. to get into medical college. And it's just something that you do because that's what everybody's doing. You're pushed along with the herd. But once I was in medical college, I just hated it. It was like, I just knew this was not for me. I was having an allergic reaction, but also you don't know what else to do. You don't know what to do. And so you study very hard, so you get good marks, and you're torn between being the topper in the class and everybody wondering why you're hating it. And, because you're the smart guy, so shouldn't you be happy? Because you're a doctor, everybody wants to be a doctor, right? I was like, this is not me at all, and just align with what I wanted. And I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know what I wanted to do. So my 20s went struggling with that. And I just accidentally stumbled upon writing. So I was the magazine secretary of my college. And I have got these, and I remember I've actually done the cover of my college magazine. And the cover is the goddess Hestia and Hygeia and Greek mythic goddesses. And I was interested in Greek art and Greek mythology at that time, but it was not a big thing at that time. It didn't matter really. This emerged much later in my mid-20s, and I started writing on mythology, and I met some editors. I used to do freelance writing a lot for magazines, and then they sort of nudged me, why don't you write more on culture? And then one thing led to it. It was very organic, and then somewhere mythology happened. And I wrote the book on Shiva. That's my first book, which I wrote in 1996. I was 26 at that time, unemployed, doing freelance work with various magazines, illustrating to earn a living, because parents are like, what's wrong with you? You're a medical doctor and you don't want to practice. And I had given my UPSC exams and I had got through, and I decided, no, this is not for me. And my parents were like terrified of what I was doing. And I think then this happened organically, and I worked in the pharma industry for 14 years because you need to earn some money. And then this was happening parallel.
But were you always challenging conventional thinking, or were you ever just following the herd?
In hindsight, I think I took tough decisions. In hindsight, because my friends tell me that, and when I look back on life, and now you have got the arrogance of I should write a autobiography one day, and so you try to remember your past and whatever you remember, and you do realize that I have taken really difficult decisions. And, it helped the fact that I was gay, and you somehow are an outsider always. You don't know a single other gay person in the world. You don't have internet at that time. You don't have any access to any information. Now, even your science textbooks don't really talk about it other than in medical terms. It's a very difficult world to live in. And I think that sort of enabled me to be the outsider. I always knew this world is not mine, and I needed to understand it. And I think that played a very key role. I emerged slowly, and it happened very organically. I found myself, I would say, truly, honestly, in my 30s. And really, it blossomed into a good space, I would say, in my late 30s. So, so it's much later. I mean, it's not an overnight success or anything. I mean, I remember when people said, oh my God, Devdutt Jaya is your, what a book you wrote, it broke mythology. And I said, by the way, that was my 10th book. They didn't know I had written 10 books before that. And I'm like, that's the reality of it. It was a struggle over time. And, I've gone through those. I worked in slums. I worked in really difficult places just to pay my bills. My 20s and 30s were very tough and traumatic. I really don't want to go back there, but I guess for the autobiography, I must.
One day you'll have to do it.
Yes.
But let me ask you about the kind of the scientific approach or the scientific temper, which is seen by many people as very important, and yet at the same time, humans appear to have a very powerful instinct towards mythology or to religion or to spirituality. Do you think most humans need mythology? Do you think they suffer if they don't embrace that aspect of their humanity?
Yes, I think it's a physiological need. It's part of your physiology, for the simple reason that we all human beings have a very developed need. And because we have a neocortex, that is a cerebrum, and you have got the ability to imagine. That is what distinguishes humans from every other species in the world. We have the imagination. Now, the imagination does one very powerful thing. The animal lives in the reality it experiences by its senses, right? So like all animals, we are all plants, animals, humans, we are all experiencing the ecosystem around us. But we can imagine an ecosystem simultaneously. So if there are 10 of us in the room, we are living in 11 ecosystems.
Mm.
And that's a conservative number. Because if you have a schizophrenic person in the room, maybe there are many more. But what I'm saying is, I live a real world that we all live in. We are living and breathing. We are all experiencing Corona at the same time. That's a common reality. But there's an imagined reality where somebody else is a villain, somebody is a hero. We have these imaginary worlds that we live in. And I think humanity emerged with the birth of imagination. So when you study cave art, you suddenly realize the struggle of humanity with this weird thing happening, and they don't know what to do with it. Because you don't know whether it's real or false, and you're dealing with this imagined reality, this imagined pain, this imagined hunger, this imagined things which are happening. Your tiger is not just a thing that you see in front of you. You're imagining a tiger. You can imagine tiger. So I think imagination plays a very important role in the birth of humanity. And people don't use the word imagination. They like to use words like consciousness. They like to use words. I see the struggle everywhere. The new word used is social construct. It's the same word as mythology. It's a little secret. We don't want to use mythology, so we will use the word social construct. It sounds better. Construct, imaginarium. I've heard these words and I say, that's mythology. You're living in... So for me, mythology is somebody's truth. Fact is everybody's truth. Fiction is nobody's truth. Myth is somebody's truth. It's a simple way of understanding. Fact is established by measurement. As a scientist, for me, if it is not measurable, I just stick to that one functional definition. You can argue about it, but a measurement is what defines science. So in medicine, you can't say you have diabetes because I feel like it. You can't say diabetes is a social construct. Right? You have to say that, no, you have to have A1C above 7. You have to have a fasting sugar level. There is a set of rules which are defining your disease state and saying, this is diabetes. You have to take this medicine so many times. This is how it works. And every scientist knows that all the numbers that you give in science are probabilities. They are not permanent. They are not accurate, but they are good functional probabilities, and you work with probabilities. Unless you're an idiot, you will never agree that these are permanent, absolute, carved in stone numbers. Science is floating and emerging with measurement. Therefore, it's ontological, not epistemological. It's ontology as far as scientists are concerned. It has to be measurement. The problem is the moment you come to the world of humanities and you deal with human beings and psychology. So as long as you're dealing with physics and chemistry, the measurement systems is more predictable. The moment you come into biology, the measurement starts getting less predictable. So zoology, botany, microbiology, the predictability starts going down, down, down. And then you come into psychology, it really goes awry. But still, it's not that you can't predict. You can predict. Behavioral sciences and all can predict, but the predictability rate has gone down. It's gone down further and further and further. And then you come to history, and therefore you're constantly, the science is trying to control, because science is based on control. And humanity is the study of lack of control. That you cannot control. And the struggle, because art and science students, science is about control and art is about the absence of control. So the creativity, when you have imagination, when you have 19th century thinking of impressionism, and you're thinking about cuboidism, and you're thinking of Picasso, they are breaking the rules of the game, and you can break and counter break and break and counter break, and you can keep doing this. You can't do that with science. You can't do that with science. Science is control. It's all about control, 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 control. Otherwise, there is no point of science. Science is about control. As I said, functional definition. It's not an absolute truth, but it's a simple way of understanding the difference. The struggle between the control and the absence of control. So
this is good. So for School of Arts and Sciences from now on, we can say the scientists are doing control and the arts faculty are doing lack of control. I want to ask you about your idea of pluralism as practiced in Indian mythology. To what extent do you see it as being the result of some kind of hegemony or domination by a particular group? So that could be an upper caste group, it could be men in general, it could be heterosexual family structures. is that a significant element of how that mythology gets written and understood?
No, these are academic terms. These are academic terms that emerge only in the 19th century. You see, the need for structure is very important in academia. And one of the structures, there are two types of structures that are very popular. One is the politicians, for example. If you're a politician, one of the, what we call right-wing very loosely, they will always use the word of outsider and insider. So the inside is pure and the outside is impure. So dirt, which Mary Douglas writes about, the concept of dirt. And you create the outsider and the other. So that is the language that is used. The invader, so it's the mother-in-law syndrome. The daughter-in-law is the invader, and therefore conflict. And that's the right-wing approach to life. They're all mother-in-laws for whom every daughter-in-law is a problem. And then you have the left-wing approach. The left-wing is above and below. You structure the world in terms of oppressor, oppressed, oppressor, oppressed. Now, so it's above and below structuring which starts to happen. And you see, it's the conflict. The father has not treated me fairly. I have been treated unfairly by the father. The father has given a bigger share of the property to the elder brother and the lesser property. And this is mythic structures around the world. And this, I'm again simplifying it for the sake of understanding. And when you start looking at this, the left-wing thinks oppressor, oppressed, oppressor, oppressed. And therefore we use words like hegemony. And we start using words. I keep asking myself, if I went to a tribal community, would I use the same words? Hunter-gatherers, where does it start using? When do you start using these words? Who decides the Brahmins are most powerful? I mean, I'll give you an example. I come from Odisha. I grew up in Odisha. I mean, I grew up in Bombay, right? In Odisha, the Brahmin lobby is seen as there. It is there. But I come from another community and we don't value Brahmins so much. It's there. And I spoke to my friends in Odisha, is it there? Is it that big thing? Because in Maharashtra, Brahmins are a very powerful lobby because the Peshwas were powerful, the Bajirao Peshwas, they were political authorities. In Odisha, they are the temple, they play a very important role. The Shasanas are the temples. But the scribes, and I come from the family of scribes, the coroners, they play a very different role. When you go to Haryana, the Brahmins don't play a very important role compared to the Jats. And the Brahmin community does not play a role at all in Punjab. You don't see that, but when you go to Tamil Nadu, the 10% Brahmins were the most powerful people. They controlled all the lands. In Kerala, the Nambudris controlled all the lands. In Bengal, they controlled all the lands. Now, if you look at the history of colonialism, they played a very important role in these, St. George, Chennai. Then you have got in Calcutta, Bombay. These three are Brahmin zones. And therefore, their writing is based on Brahminism because they're writing what they're seeing. They are not seeing the parts of India where Brahmins never played an important role. And they were just minority communities. So these words, we construct these words to suit our own. And nowadays, many historians write about it. We see some of the most best historians will constantly talk about their own political mindset. So for example, I don't remember his name. Manu Devadevan has given this interview on television with his teacher, Keshavan Vasudeva, something. Keshav, I'm not 100% sure of this. He keeps saying that I wrote this book during the emergency. And therefore, he is expressing his rage at the emergency. And therefore, his textbook is influenced by it. So, you know, these are not truths. These are structures used by academicians to explain a complex world.
But isn't it often a question of naming something that people know exists, but the academic is seeking to identify it and put it into words? And very often the historical record that we have is written by the dominant people who, if you like, won a particular battle. So that's the version that's most readily identifiable.
Yes, it is. And that's all we have. That's all we have. And even then it's complex. It's not that simple. Writing stories and the winner takes it. And if I look at the world through the lens of oppression, the assumption is one day this will go away. It never does. The idea of insider and outsider, it will never go. There'll always be an inside and an outside. And there'll always be invasions and impurities. It will never go away. So both will lose their battles. You have to rise above structures. You have to know the value of structures. And I think that's what Shankara meant when he wrote this. I mean, Shankara didn't write this line really, but it's attributed to Adi Shankaracharya, Jagat Mithya Brahma Satyam. And I will give you an academic translation of this. The world, everybody assumes the world is epistemological. Only Brahma is ontological. So he is using it because Jagat Mithya is epistemological truths, which is created in the mind. It's created in the mind. And ontological truth is which is outside the mind. And this conflict, because we cannot access the world without going through our mind. I access the world. In fact, now we're not even going through our mind. We're going through virtual reality. I'm going through virtual reality to see you. So for all you know, Facebook is playing a clever game and fooling me that Patrick French is right in front of me. It's a game that is being played by the Silicon 7.
Silicon 7, oh my God.
Yes, the new Saptarishis. So the thing is, we have to remember that we're going through our mind, and the human mind, and it's a human mind. And this is the struggle which the Vedanta scholars are talking about. What is real? You know, is the serpent and the rope is the example that they give. What is real? What is ontological? When they say real, they say what they mean is what is ontology and what is epistemology. These words are used now, but 1,000 years ago, there were scholars using this word in a different way. And we all know the world is language. And therefore, in the Vedas also, they keep saying vaka, 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 language, language, language. Grammar is important. Vedas don't have, what is called, they don't have full stops and commas. There is no full stop. Veda is considered to be a single sentence.
Yeah.
There is no comma, there's no full stop, there's no paragraph, there is no punctuation. Not at all. It's one sentence, ekavakya. Now, what are they trying to say? Why are they saying this? They're trying to say that we are structuring it. We need punctuations. We need grammar. We need etymology. We need this to create and make sense of this world which makes no sense. And so we create words like hegemony and oppression. It's not that there is no injustice. It is at a functional level, these words are important. But to say that there is justice in the world is to say there is God in the world. Both are myths. Both are myths. For me, justice is an atheist myth. And justice is a monotheist, justice is an atheist myth. Just as God is a monotheist myth. And these are myths. These are structures and constructs that enable us to live a comfortable life. We would like to believe there is justice. Otherwise, we'll go mad. And some people need God.
So we've got quite a few questions from faculty and from students, but I'm just going to ask you one more before going on to those. And that is really about the way that in the Mahabharata and in other texts, you get this mixture of everything from fear, love, kindness, compassion, warfare. It's an extraordinary mix of really every emotion. And I wanted to ask you, why is it, do you think, that some people feel a fear of religion, a fear of the idea of religion?
This is an idea that sort of emerges with the rise of science. Okay, this fear of religion is an idea that emerges with the rise of science. And science as its subject starts emerging in its powerful form only again in the 19th century, where what is religion? Religion is about faith and science is about doubt. Right? And science only succeeds if you have doubt. That means, what does doubt mean? Just because my teacher said so doesn't mean true. I will test it myself and I'll figure out whether it matters. Right? So that's what it is. The thing is, human life is not based on doubt. Life needs faith. So when you see what happens when you study postmodernism too much, you're always angry because you're finding flaws everywhere. And you keep saying this is problematic and that is problematic. And you keep saying life is problematic. And therefore you're eternally miserable because you're seeking Purushottama, the perfect man, or the perfect woman, or the perfect lover. And life is organic. It's moving all the time. But if you're trained to see flaws, and the only purpose of life is flaws, so that's what happens. So, I think these words like fear of religion is the fear of people with great faith. Because I want to doubt everything, right? I get power by doubting. And I meet someone who doesn't doubt. I hate him. It's a structure. He's the other. I have created the other by defining the person who is absolutely faith. I believe in my mother. She's the most wonderful thing on earth. And I'm a POMO graduate. I'm like, no, that's problematic. And because your mother has these 20,000 flaws. And it's how dare you say such things about mother, I'm going to cut your head off. Because my mother is my mother. And I think she's the best thing in the world. So that's what happens. Faith and doubt, they're two sides of the coin. And that's the problem, especially with academia. And what I would use the word is the Western model. And it's by Western model, I mean, is the one life model, where you try to go to an extreme idea and then you yo-yo back to the original idea. And you keep yo-yoing between extremes, the left and the right. And the Indian model is both. Because it, depending on the situation, each one brings value to the table. It's not that Hindutva is bad, but it has elements that are useful. But liberalism is not bad, but there are elements that are useful and there are elements that are not good. And there are elements in it. So everything, like a tree, has so many things. Not everything part of a tree is good. Not every part of an animal that you kill is going to be consumed. So you have to understand, this pluralism allows you to see things in this complex way. Unilateralism or monotheism or monotruism, ideas like human rights, very frightening and violent, because it is imposed, it is just a secular version of religion. We all have to agree on this one idea. And people don't realize structurally it comes from the Greeks. That there is one thing which unites us, and then you can be different below that. You can be different below, and that's a hegemonic idea. And I keep saying that you use the word hegemony and you're applying hegemony. Hegemony is this. Just because it sounds so sweet, human rights. It sounds so... I remember this conference I've gone to where people said, what has democracy given India? And I said, caste vote banks. And I think the people in the room got very angry with me because they wanted me to say something lovely and wonderful about democracy. And I was like, I'm not going to give you that joy. You know, what I do is when I go to left-wing conferences, I become a right-wing. And when I go to a right-wing conference, I become left-wing. And, you know, so I become feminine in a masculine space and masculine in a feminine space. So you're a patriarch somewhere and you're a feminist somewhere. And I think that fluidity forces you to appreciate the fluidity of myths and imaginaries and constructs. And you start having genuine conversations because you don't take a stand. You try to solve problems. You don't try to take a stand. You're not ideological. You're saying, okay, what works here? What works here? And that's what medicine taught me a lot, because you can learn so much in medicine, but when you're working in a village hospital, you can't get the best medicines in the world. You have to work with what you have. You can't say, if at all I was in Delhi and AIMS, I got robotic laser surgery. Yeah, you have got a little blunt knife, butter knife in your hand. You have to operate with that. And you figure out what to do, because that's what life has given you. And I think that's what I learned from, you know, the idea of pluralism. Yes, I have great ideas, but ultimately I have to work with it. You know, it's a balance between the Platonic and the Aristotelian. You know, the ideal, we can read up in academic, but when you come to the world, it's Aristotelian. You have to work with what you have, see what you can see, and work with what you've got. And you'll not get the ideal, but ideal has its place. I will not reject Plato. But it doesn't mean Aristotle is perfect either. So that's what I mean, this yo-yoing between the two. Left is good and right is bad, or right is good, left is bad. Nonsense. Head shake.
So I like this chameleon effect as a way of making people rethink. I'm just going to ask my colleague Ratna Ghoshal from the Biological and Life Sciences Division. I think your microphone is open if you want to ask your question. If it's not, then I can ask it on your behalf, Ratna. Okay, so I think maybe that's not opening up. So what she wanted to ask was, what made you choose your career in Hindu mythology? And is it easier to be a Hindu by religion and then criticize and comment on your own religion, rather than commenting on other different religious traditions and practices?
So the first question was, it was organic. Honestly, I never thought I would make money out of mythology. It was something that I did on the side. Even now when I meet artists, I keep telling them, make sure you have a source of income so that you don't depend on others. You can pay your bills. And I worked in the pharma industry till the age of 38. So I keep telling people, I worked in the pharma industry. I paid my bill. I bought my first house with the salary I earned in a company. And I did mythology at the same time. I would work double shifts and work all night on my mythology without expectations that this will one day becomes what it is today. This was a pleasant surprise, and that I could afford to do this 24/7 on my own and earn a living out of it, which was Lucky. I was very, very lucky. Even if it had not happened, I would have continued doing my work. And there are many people in India and around the world who do very good work. They'll be working as professors somewhere. I know army, musicians who work in the army, and they do really good research work on musical instruments. You find these people, what is called the amateur. You find these, and I was really an amateur, and I became a professional because of circumstances, and and I was lucky. I got the right people at the right time. Luck. I mean, karma. We can call it, maybe God liked me. I can give any story I want, depending on who the audience is. And the point is about Hinduism, yes. I can be very critical about Hinduism because I'm a Hindu. If I do a lot of writing on Islam. And of course, the Hindutva will say, do this about Islam, and they'll cut your head and cut your hands. And I'm like, yeah, I know that Charlie Hebdo. And of course, Charlie Hebdo was being mischievous and unnecessarily provocative. That's not needed. Provocation is not freedom of speech. It's just disrespect. So let's not go there. Respect is very important. And for me, when you're doing, for example, when we were anatomy students in medicine, we had to cut bodies, right? Dead bodies had to be cut. We had the dead bodies of people who lived, and their bodies are on our table, and we're cutting their little parts. And the doctor would always tell us, and our teachers, remember, respect them, respect them. These are people whose bodies we are treating as if they are put in formalin for the entire year. Respect the bodies that you're cutting. This was someone's mother, brother, uncle, aunt. And I think that's what students have to do, if I'm studying other religions. But the fact is, I will always be criticized. If I write on feminism, I'll be criticized. Oh, you're not a woman. What do you know? If I write on Dalits, I will be criticized. If I write on anything, because nowadays everybody wants to find everything problematic. So you have to just accept the world that it's okay to be criticized. I don't get upset so long as you buy my books. I am fine. First, buy my book, then you get the right to criticize. So, Dakshana is important. Without Dakshana, comments are not of any value. You don't matter.
So let me ask you a question from my colleague, Professor Murari Jha, who's a historian. He says, in pre-modern Indian society, what were the pathways by which myths were created, consumed, disseminated, modified, discredited, improvised? And apart from the classic Brahmanic tradition, what role did myths play in tribal or indigenous society, and can they be retrieved?
So there cannot be a human society without myth. Let's begin with that. The earliest evidence of myth is 100,000 years old. The fact that you bury the dead indicates mythic thinking. The two indicators of mythic thinking are three. There are three indicators of mythic thinking in Paleolithic societies. One, cave art. Cave art. Why do you do cave art? What is the reason to express yourself using a visual form? Why do you create art? Because that is the step one. So that is the first indicator that you have moved. When does paleontology become archaeology? When does humanity start? Humanity starts, it's not with initially what is called the early Stone Age is only implements. That is not where mythic thinking has started yet, because you've controlled fire, you've created, your mythic thinking emerges in this point where you create one, cave art, second, beads and ornaments. So ornaments, you have to see aesthetics. Aesthetics have to, so there's art, there's aesthetics and burial. Burial is the clinching point. The moment I see burial, I know mythic, because the assumption that there's something after death is imagination. So it is not a Brahminical thinking. Brahminical is the tiniest part of Indian myth. It is unfortunate that it is the dominant part because we think it's the least important thing in India. Really, I'm interested in your kitchen. If you want to study mythology, you have to go to the kitchen. Why does the Chinese kitchen use chopsticks? Why does the Western kitchen start using cutlery? It did not use cutlery 1,000 years ago. Why did cutlery come into the picture? How did cutlery come? The use of fork and knife. It's a 300-year-old, 400-year-old phenomenon. 500 at best. But people ate with hand, and they ate lying down in the Roman times. That's how you ate. And the Chinese use chopsticks. They've been using chopsticks for over 4,000 years, 3,000 conservative estimate. And Indians have been using the fingers, and we eat in a particular way even now. That's ritual. That's language. That's myth. But if you really want to study mythology, you have to study ritual practices. You have to study, as I said, 3 words: story, symbol, ritual. So when I go to a tribal community, what clothes are they wearing? What tattoos are they wearing? Why are they dressing up in a particular way to say that tribal community is what you see when you want to talk about caste. You can't study caste without studying tribes. There is no concept of intertribal marriage. Concept of purity is very important in tribes. The concept of dirt, of taboo, of touching certain things and not touching certain things. These are tribal concepts. These are not caste concepts. They come into the caste system and they are sort of elevated by the Brahmins into a different level of conversation and becomes darker and darker over time. But every tribe has its boundaries. The concept of boundaries is mythic. It doesn't exist in nature. It's not a natural phenomenon. So mythic, this is mine. The biggest myth is property. How do you define this is your property? So you used to bury the dead to say this is my property because my relatives are buried in the soil. And the Vedic culture did not, because they were nomadic and various reasons, we don't know 100% sure, they never buried the dead, which means you can't claim the land. You have to put the bones in the river and you have to bury. So there's no trace of the dead, which is the opposite of dolmens that you see in pre-Vedic culture in India. India had burial practices to claim the land. So you claim the land through burial. And when you cremate the dead, you don't claim the land. So that's the practice. Unfortunately, now all politicians want to be buried and have memorials built around them because they want to claim the land. This idea of claiming that, so you have to see mythology in a more complex way. This is the Ahmedabad University. I'm talking to academicians and students. So I'm raising the bar. But Ramayana Mahabharata is, as I said, just for money. It's good fun. But that's not mythology. That's like what, 5% of mythology, just 5%. That's the iceberg, the top tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I remember interviewing somebody from an indigenous community in the Northeast who talked about the way that the entire religious practice in cosmology was organized around the hearth, the cooking hearth in the home. And that was really the center of the worldview of that community. And I realized during that conversation that a lot of preconceptions about how things are meant to work are actually externally imposed. They're not how they're thought about within that community.
You have to see the insider's view. Many people don't see the insider's view.
Let me ask you a question from Devani, who is a student. It's really about translation. If somebody translates or does their version of the Gita into Marathi or another language, doesn't it lose its essence? Doesn't it lose its originality?
The reality of life is that you will never be understood, no matter how hard you try. All communication leads to misunderstanding. So you please read post-structuralism. You'll be depressed because all life is about, and in fact, if you read postmodernism, they'll say you can never be understood. In fact, your point of life is not to be understood. You will never know what the poet is trying to tell. So don't even bother. The poet himself doesn't know what he's trying to tell. So they go to the other extreme of it. So this assumption that there is a truth in the Vedas or there's a truth in the Gita itself is flawed. It's a flawed argument. It's the idea that it's like Atma. I always use the word Atma as this nebulous idea of there is something beneath the body. There is something beneath the text. There is something, and we're looking for the elusive Atma. And we are saying that when I remove all the words and the grammar and the structure of Gita, so Gita has been studied only hermeneutically. It has not been studied structurally. I have tried to study structurally and people just don't get it. That Gita can be studied structurally. It's not just a hermeneutic approach. Now these are words, I think the first year students will get scared. But these are the fun parts of the Gita because nobody's done a structural analysis of the Gita. Not that I know of, that maybe somebody has. But you have to do a structural analysis of the Gita. If you don't do a structural analysis and you try to understand the Gita using hermeneutic approach, which is the traditional approach and the most common approach, that itself is not done so well. But you have to do a structural understanding of the Gita. And you will see the structural understanding of the Gita. Then there's a historical approach to studying the Gita. So the Gita can be understood at so many different levels. What is the real Gita? You know, and there's a historical Gita because when Krishna himself repeats the Gita, known as Anu Gita, at the end of the Mahabharata war, it is very different from the Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah.
So if Krishna himself repeats the Gita, it's called the Anu Gita, which nobody talks about, does not refer to Bhakti Yoga at all, then Krishna himself is giving a different understanding.
Yeah.
Because the context has changed. Before the war, Bhagavad Gita. After the war, Anu Gita. Context is different. Bhagavad Gita changes. So let's understand Gita so there is, if somebody tells you, and this is a classic, unfortunately, 19th century view, which is very popular in Hindutva because most Hindutva intellectuals are stuck in the 19th century. And I say this with a lot of experience. I know them, some of them are very good friends of mine. And it's quite funny because I just say that kabhi to padho beyond Vivekanand, because Vivekanand died before Harappa was discovered. You know, Vivekanand did not know Harappa existed. So his understanding is limited by what he read. He did not read Tamil literature. He did not read Odia literature. He did not read Marathi literature. He would not have been exposed to it because these works were not translated. It's
that is an extraordinary thought, actually, that he would have been unaware of all of that. Yeah.
He is unaware. Like, for example, 1970s, we discovered the BMAC archaeological sites in Russia, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, what is called the Aryan corridor, from where it comes. This was not known till the 1970s, and these studies have emerged only in the 1990s. Today, we know that horses and chariots existed in the world only in 1500 BC. Not before that, not 2000 years, not 4000 years ago, only 3,500 years ago. 4,000 years ago, the world did not know chariots. 3,500 years ago, that becomes the great war machine used in Egypt, used in Mesopotamia, used in India, used in China. But 4,000 years ago, that is 2000 BCE, it did not exist. Now, how do you explain this to people? How do you explain to people that 4,000 years ago, there's something called the Meghalayan age? Now, this is an idea which emerged only 1 year ago. That 4,200 years ago, there was a huge series of droughts which lasted for 200 years, which destroyed the old empire in Egypt, which destroyed Harappa, which destroyed the Akkadian civilization, which destroyed Chinese civilization. Now, these are new ideas. I know this only now, and I only know it because of internet. If you read my books which were written 30 years ago, I don't talk about Meghalayan age. But today, if I write a book, I'll write about Meghalayan age. Because now I have known this new knowledge. So knowledge is continuously emerging.
Let me ask you a connected question from Aparajita Basu, who introduced us, who's a historian. She's asking, what do you make of the way in which Hindutva is attributing veracity to mythology? For example, the idea that Ram was a real human being, ancient weapons may have been nuclear weapons. Where do you think this literalization of mythology comes from? And is there a healthy way to engage in a societal desire or nostalgia for mythology?
You see, it comes from low self-esteem. There are two things. Low self-esteem, I want to prove that I'm better than you. If that's your yearning, you will meet professors like that, you will meet politicians like that, you'll meet people who have this yearning to say I'm better than you. So it's a psychological problem. And the second is a capability problem. Understanding metaphors is not easy. Talk to any English professor. Understanding metaphors is a challenge. And metaphorical language, literal language is so much easier. But we always feel misunderstood in our relationships because people don't get it. Not everybody is good with language. Some people use, like, for example, some people can't say I love you, but they will express their love through certain actions. And they will be there for you when you are in bad times, but they will not say the word I love you. Indian parents never said I love you. I never saw my father telling my mother I love you. And I watch American serials where parents are saying I love you and they kiss each other. And I would look at my parents and my mother would say abhadra, vulgar. For her it was vulgar. This is what nonsense. They're kissing in front of their children. What kind of civilization has come to an end? And I knew my mother and father were very fond of each other. They would have their chai together every day at 4 o'clock. And when my father died, my mother would weep every day at 4 o'clock in the evening because she missed my dad a lot. But I don't think she would ever say, I loved your father. For her, that idea was vulgar. So the thing is, everybody expresses it differently. What has happened with Hindutva, and it's basically low self-esteem. And we have to allow this. It's a very big wave. Everybody feels ahankara. The ahankar in Sanskrit is when you start believing that you are better than others. And when ahankar comes, it crumples your mind. And when it crumples your mind, you can't understand metaphors. To understand metaphors, you have to uncrumple your mind. Uncrumpling your mind is yoga. Yoga is yoga chitta vriddhi nirodha, which is basically uncrumple your mind. Because when you uncrumple your mind, which is how science works, they will always say in science, don't use bias, don't use bias, don't use bias, measurement. In science, you use the crutch of measurement. In philosophy, you have to use the process of tapasya in order to get out of bias. The moment I think I'm better than someone else, I have lost the plot.
Let me ask you a question from our student Adnan. He's saying, isn't imagination and myth a defense mechanism to save us from life's harsh reality?
It is both the problem and the solution. If you didn't have imagination, you can't create anything in the world. You can't have a hypothesis. All science is based on a hypothesis, which you then have a thesis to prove that it is true. How do you create hypothesis without imagination? I met a neuroscientist, this very famous Professor Ramachandra. I had dinner with him. And he said, Devdutt, the simple act of taking a rock and tying it to a stick. So you take a stick in one hand and a rock, and then you fix the two to create a club, is an extremely complex neurological phenomena. You have to imagine it in order to be able to do it. Mm. You can't do it without imagining it because nobody else does it. You don't mimic. There's no mimicry involved. So when you talk to neurobiologists and neuropsychologists, they will not use the word imagination. I remember Professor Ramachandra said that I will not use the word. It's a problem for me as a science person because I can't define it. So I will not use the word. But he says, I know what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. You are right. Because the struggle of, if you don't have imagination, you can't create poetry. You can't create music. You can't have concepts. You can have only descriptions. You cannot have conceptual thinking. You don't see infinity. How do you come up with calculus? Ideas like calculus. How do you come up with ideas like justice? Because they don't exist. There's no thing out there to say this is justice. Mm-hmm. Equality. Where do these words come from? They're coming from imagination. They don't exist. Infinity. So look at a science student and say, where is infinity? Where does zero? Zero. Can you see zero? You have to imagine the absence of something, and therefore you concept the concept of zero. So Shunya, which is a Buddhist concept, Ananta, which is a Hindu concept, these are philosophical concepts and mathematical concepts come from imagination. All inventions come from imagination. All innovations come from imagination. So tell me a world without imagination and I'll show you an animal.
Okay, so here's a connected question coming from Balaji Prakash, who's the Associate Dean of Sciences at the school. He's a structural biologist. He says, I want to know what you mean by the word control. Don't you think that it is, quote, lack of control or breaking away from control that led to discoveries beginning from Galileo to Einstein to anyone else? Because even in science, it's imagination that leads to new science. And in that sense, it's the art of imagining new things that leads you to discovery.
When people say, I want science to be useful, what they mean is I want technology. I want technology to control. So it's technology which we use to control. So science is constantly looking at breaking frontiers and frontiers and frontiers. It keeps breaking frontiers. It never ends. It's an infinite journey. Every scientist knows that. So when I'm using the word science, I'm using it loosely with technology, really. We create what is called applied sciences. I want to control. And I want to make the world a better place. The moment someone says, I want to make the world a better place, there you've seen a control freak emerging. Because science is about realizing the uselessness of that you can't control. You have to work with nature. So people have used nature in different ways. Science has not always given rise to technology. Many communities will work with the currents you worked with the currents of water and you work with the currents. We decided to control it. We said, hey, let's create a system whereby I can bypass. So I created the steam ships, which could bypass water currents. I don't need the wind anymore. So we construct and we try to control. So technology really is the word I should use rather than science. But for most people, they don't understand the difference between science and technology. So the frontier sciences will always keep saying that, okay, they will always be in the world of probabilities. They will enjoy the world of calculus. They will not seek control. But what the common man looks at science is control. While the artist is constantly, that's a crazy person coming up. And therefore we have this concept of mad scientist. What was the mad scientist trying to do? We imagine that he was going to destroy the world. And he creates, and if you look at the Siddhas, the whole idea of Siddha in mythology, the idea of control, it's all about control. Siddha is all about control. So it's a good words to keep in mind is why am I studying and why am I doing what am I doing?
Okay, so we got a little comeback from Balaji here. He's saying applied science is more engineering and technology. Science is understanding the mysteries of the world and science is closer to art.
Okay. Only art doesn't have measurement. If you remove measuring instrument, then it becomes art. Then it's pure art.
So we've got about another 10 minutes to go. I'm going to give you a question from Jaina, who is asking, do you feel that mythology brings meaning to the void in life, to Shruyatva?
So, sorry, I lost that a little bit.
Do you feel that mythology brings meaning to the void in life, to Shruyatva in life?
Yes, the main purpose of mythology is meaning, to give meaning. That's the purpose. Because the imagination, which animals don't seek meaning. I mean, you can argue that no animals actually do, and all that is, again, your imagination telling you these stories. But it is the imagination makes you wonder what value you bring to the world. And therefore, the words like value, meaning, emerge from imagination. These are concepts that emerge from imagination, that you need to be meaningful. That you need to be meaningful itself is what your imagination is tormenting you with. It's tormenting you with that you have to be useful. When I give management lectures, I'm always told, what is purpose? What is function? You know, I have the privilege of working with very rich and powerful people. And I always hear them saying that I have a function, I have a purpose. And I keep telling them, sir, if you disappear today, the world will continue. And they don't like you after that. Of course, your contract is immediately cut. You have to keep saying that, no, you are the flower from where the pollen emerges, which is going to pollinate the world with noble ideas. And then, of course, you get a lot of grant. But the fact is, no, you are fodder.
Let me ask you a question from Shweta. She's asking the process of what she calls religionization, meaning ethics plus faith and social norms, getting married and so on, that it's becoming increasingly difficult for these to be segregated, and what needs to be done to segregate it again. So I guess it's a way of asking, you know, whether it's conceptually possible to go back to an earlier version of how religion or mythology is conceived.
Why don't you try an experiment? Get 3 students of postmodernism to come up with a common code of conduct for the university. If you can succeed, then it is possible. Which has to make everyone happy. Not going to happen. That's the problem. These words like ethics, morality, even human rights emerged before the rise of studies like post-structuralism, postmodernism, which emerged in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and really reached fruition in the 1990s. You have to see the history of these subjects. Derrida, Foucault, all of these people, these thinkers are emerging in the post-war period because they're challenging structure, they're challenging language, they're challenging everything. These ideas have only now reached a very, very volatile space, and now we are questioning them, and we're saying, hey, wait a minute. So there's a postmodernism where you're challenging this approach to philosophy, which emerge, and people are saying, wait a minute. So what has happened is this words like reason, ethics, structure. These are ideas which come from the structure world, which came in the 1930s and before the Second World War. So Second World War is a very nice time where you sort of see what happens before and what happens after. Science before that was very different. Science after that, everybody thought technology is going to save the world. I have not heard a single technologist who predicted the arrival of drones. Please go through the history of people who were selling ideas like social media, virtual media in the 1980s, when it emerged, 1990s. Look at all the literature. Nobody. There is a very famous conversation between Terry Pratchett, who is a fantasy novelist, and Bill Gates. Please read that conversation between these two men. One is a fantasy novelist, so art, and the other is an engineer, Bill Gates, the creator of the Windows and this one who wants to save the world with charitable activities. Talk to them, and he's like, you are creating the most dangerous weapon in the world. And you read the essay, and he's predicting, because he's a fantasy writer, he can see how humans will function given a tool. And that you will not make the world a better place. Every time you create a tool, we see how to kill someone.
I'll tell you a story about Terry Pratchett, that when I used to live in rural Wiltshire in southwest England, I remember one day somebody was doing some repair work on the house, and they said, oh, you know, there's another writer who lives like about 2 miles that way. And I'm like, oh, okay, I didn't know. And he goes, oh, it's Terry Pratchett. And I'd never heard of Terry Pratchett. And then Terry Pratchett was doing an event in a local town, and I'm, oh, that's the guy who lives just up the road. Maybe I'll go in. And then there's like about 2,000 people in there, and I realized that I'd missed out on some story of a famous famous writer. So I did actually. I met him towards the end of his life.
Brilliant, man.
Devdutt, let me ask you one more question. This one comes from Tirth, and it's: do you feel that all of Hinduism wants to tell you is that it's your choice to do what you want, and that there's no entity to guide you as to what's right and wrong? Because we don't seem to find scriptures conveying instructions of what people ought to do.
Well, the only instruction is that you exist in a social ecosystem. So it's not, we must differentiate between what is called individualism in the West from individualism in India. In individualism in the West has unfortunately descended to isolationism. You exist. So when you talk of liberty, I'm always talking about liberty to do whatever I want to do. So it's an isolation from the rest of the world. I have the freedom to do whatever I want. I can dress the way I want. That's the conversation of independent thinking in the West. In India, the individual is part of an ecosystem, and therefore there's a constant negotiation with the world. So you can't do whatever you want. You're constantly dealing with the reality of the world around you and the 10 people around you, the boss, the subordinate, the responsibilities that you have. And that creates a bubble, which effectively then you have to decide whether you want to control them or let them control you, and the negotiation between them. And that defines your life really. You don't need a scripture. If you're surrounded by 3 horrible sisters, what do? You have to find a way of surviving. Either work with them, make them friend, make them foe, fight them, scream with them, decide who's the oppressor, who's the insider, outsider. You're going to do this whether you like it or not. The moment human beings come together, our imaginations will play games with us. And when we use words like Sanatan Dharma, they mean this. They mean this, which is intrinsically, you don't need an external book to enable you to deal with human beings. You have to work with each other. Like a plant has to work with the plants around it. A tree has to work with the trees around it. We are no different. We would like to believe we are different because we have imagination. But we are just an organism, and every organism needs an ecosystem. You cannot have an organism that exists outside an ecosystem. Only an object can exist outside an ecosystem. I mean, that's also a very simplistic concept, but I'm just explaining. You can throw a rock in space and it will remain a rock. If I throw you into space, you will die.
So I'm just now going to hand back to Sarthak and to Aparajita so they can give you a final thank you for this wonderfully varied event today, Devdutt. And while I'm doing that, I will also just share the screen for this event that I think many people will very much enjoy. It's a sort of investigative event really about what are the classics in the modern world. And we've got Simon Goldhill, David Shulman, Shishir Saxena, 3 great scholars taking part in that. It actually connects, I think, also to some of the things we've been discussing today. How do we understand the distant past? How do we conceive of it? So a very big thank you from me to Devdutt Pattanaik, and I'll pass over to Aparajita and to Sarthak.
Aparajita, can I take over?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Okay. So thank you so much, Devdutt, and thank you so much, Patrick, for really, having this very engaging kind of a conversation. And I think at a time when we all are, kind of pressed to find the meanings of these multiple diversities and pluralities of identity, or, whether it is about gender, caste, or class, or religion, especially, it becomes very pertinent to trace this in this idea of Indian mythology. And I think all the the answers that you gave to all these questions were really, enlightening and also very informative. And I think what most of these are also, like I think Patrick said in the beginning, that you also force us to rethink, and you also will definitely be encouraging all of us to think a little more about our own ideas about these questions. So we really thank you for this kind of fascinating talk, and for this to Patrick also for facilitating this very interesting conversation. And at the same time, I would also like to thank so many of the participants who had registered and who had shown this kind of an enthusiasm for, at a very short span of time, within a very short span of time, they had registered and they had attended this event, whether through the Zoom link or through the YouTube, live streaming link, because actually the kind of encouragement that we are receiving on this online version is also what is helping us, driving us to come out of the university and make this event more and more oriented towards general public, and to make it more inclusive and more accommodating to again the plurality of audiences that are existing beyond only academics and beyond only faculty and staff members. So we are really thankful for the audience participation for this also, and we hope, like Patrick said, the next there will be an event on what are the classics, and before we delve into the past, there is also an event which talks about the very contemporary, which talks about the idea of elections in the middle of pandemic, and that will be there next week. So we will watch out for the space, and we will be contacting all of you over email regarding that event as well, and we hope that you will be able to participate in that as well. And I would also like to thank all the, like I said, all the audience members, but also the technical team, the IT team, and a big thanks to Priyana from the Office of the Dean of Social Science, School of Arts and Sciences. So Priyana has has been the rock of support for us for organizing all the events. So big thank you to Priyana, and I am really pleased to have this kind of a very fruitful end to this conversation. And Prachita, if you have any last words.
I'm just going to echo what you said, Sarthak. This was a really interesting conversation, and might I say also a very engaging one. I think the way that you spoke, Mr. Pattanaik, was really interesting and not very stodgy, and you're very accustomed to people speaking about these issues in a very kind of droning fashion. So I'll take many things away from this talk, and the amusing bit of which I'll take away is the renewed valuation of the head nod. Head shake, I should say. Thank you.
We didn't realize that we have an asset in this, so we will cherish this more. But in the end, a very heartfelt thanks to all of you who made this webinar a great success. Thank you so much.